This is Talkin' Mule Deer with your hosts Steve Belinda and Jody Stemler. Talkin' Mule Deer takes you on a journey to learn more about the Mule Deer Foundation, mule deer and black-tailed deer biology and management, tips and tactics for hunting, conservation issues, and even features some of our corporate and celebrity partners. Now, let's start talking mule deer. Hey, it's Jody Stemler. We're here talking mule deer in Laramie, Wyoming today.
Hi, and I'm Steve Belinda, and joining us today is Professor Matt Kaufman and Greg Nickerson from the Wyoming Migration Initiative. Welcome, folks.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for joining us. This is exciting to be up here with you guys. It's a little chilly in Laramie today, but it's a beautiful day. Thank you for welcoming us into the Berry Institute, which is where you guys do most of your work, right?
Yeah. Well, we do part of our work here. Our offices are actually in the over in the Biological Sciences building, which was built about 50 years ago.
Yeah. I don't think this building was here when I did my grad work. It's pretty new. I had to actually pull it up on the map to find it. So nice digs, though. So this beautiful book sitting in front of me. I know you guys have been busy the last 4 or 5 days launching this new atlas.
Tell us what it's all about. What'd you do?
Yeah. So. The atlas just came out in about mid-October, and it's the result of 6 years of work. We kind of had this idea to put an atlas together when we started recognizing that there was a lot of interest in migration, especially in Wyoming, and at the same time, a lot of new research coming on with GPS collars and the sort of detailed movement paths, and really, the public is just so interested in migrations. And I had the idea of creating wild migrations, the atlas, when I saw the Atlas of Yellowstone, which is the first atlas of a national park. And when that came out, they actually wanted to do some migration pages in that atlas, but it didn't make it in the final cut. But that kind of gave me the idea of, like, the public is so interested in this, and, what better way to show migrations than with maps? Right.
Yeah. Well, the public's interested in it somewhat as a result of what you all have been doing through the Wyoming Migration Initiative. So tell us a little bit more. First of all, let me back up a little bit. You are part of the Cooperative Research Unit here at the University of Wyoming. And I want to bring that up because this is a lot of the science in a lot of the states for wildlife management, wildlife ecology, are through cooperative research units. So tell me about that a little bit, and then how you started working on the science of migration before you even got to Migration Initiative and the public interest in it.
Yeah, so I wear a couple of different hats, right? My job is through the U.S. Geological Survey, so I'm an employee of the USGS, and I direct something called the Wyoming Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, which is one of 34 or 35 co-op units around the U.S., and the co-op units are always embedded in a university, and they're basically this solution to have universities to sort of harness the power of the universities to do wildlife science, but do that in a way that they can sort of work hand in hand with the state wildlife managers and federal wildlife and federal as well. Yep. But every, like, our co-op unit, the cooperators are the USGS, the University of Wyoming, the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, and then the Wildlife Management Institute. And one of the things that's unique about the Wyoming unit is Wyoming is a small state, and the Wyoming Game and Fish is a small unit, and they don't have their own research capacity. So for over 30 years, the Wyoming co-op unit has sort of served as the research branch of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department.
So you will have undergrad or graduate students, and you'll help to kind of direct some of the science, working with the agencies on what they need, and then some of your graduate students and some of your own researchers will do the science. Is that the way it works?
Yeah. So essentially, the Wyoming Game and Fish Department basically comes up, so they sort of poll their biologists in the various regions, and the management needs and the research ideas flow up from those offices, and then we sit down with them and kind of have a discussion about, well, how can we, is this can we do research? Can we design a study that can address this management need, or provide
sort of a practical application of the need that we're seeing out in the field?
Right. those projects are all driven by the management questions, the information needs that the state wildlife managers have. And then we get together, design a study that can address that question, recruit a graduate student to work on the project. Almost all of our projects have graduate students, and graduate student training is a big part of our mission. And then we do the work, and it's a really great model because especially for the students, because they kind of have they have their committee here at the university and that sort of academic support, but then in the field, in many cases, and these are the best projects, they also have like a field mentor from like a Wyoming Game and Fish Department manager who introduces them to the community, introduces them to the sportsmen, to the other land managers, and is really kind of, they have sort of a liaison in the community. And also that relationship, it's really beneficial for the students because they start to learn, what wildlife managers have to consider in managing our wildlife.
Well, and it's a great, it's obviously it's great because you're solving science needs. You're meeting needs of real-time wildlife issues that the states are dealing with, states and in some cases federal agencies and others. But then the students, the benefits that they get and the opportunity, it seems like a great way to groom people who are going to be our future wildlife managers in what, the traditions of our wildlife management and understanding the big picture and how their science fits into a whole bigger landscape and not just what, counting deer turds, as we used to say back in my undergraduate work.
Well, knowing a little bit about the unit and knowing some of the previous leaders and some of the folks who set it up, I think the only drawback is you got to sort of be slave to being a federal employee and working with all these other entities, and man, that probably gets complicated and frustrating.
Well, it's actually I think one of the unique aspects of the co-op unit program is that we kind of get to operate a little bit independently from, at least from the more the bureaucratic dimensions of the federal government, because we're here and every co-op unit is embedded in a university, and the USGS pays our salaries, but all of the project funding and hiring, all that happens through the university. And so those university processes tend to be more streamlined and a little more flexible than the federal government. And so that, and then of course, the co-op unit scientists, wherever they might be around the U.S., and their students, are embedded in those universities. And so that's just a rich place to do research. And so it's a really successful program, and Jody, you kind of hit it on the head. And this isn't unique to the Wyoming unit. All co-op unit students, essentially, while they're doing research, work with managers, and it could be this. And often it is the state wildlife managers, but sometimes it's the Bureau of Land Management, it's the U.S. Forest Service, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and so that perspective, when they come out at the end, not only have they worked with those managers to sort of shape what the research questions should be, or additional research components that really address questions that the managements have, or sort of put the information at a scale that the managers can use to actually make decisions. But then also when they come out, they're familiar with those agencies and how they operate and what their mission is, and that's stuff that we can't really teach here at the university.
And one more thing I would add to what you're saying, Matt, is that this sort of cooperative arrangement between the university and Game and Fish also benefits from a lot of private groups that are supporting nonprofits that are supporting wildlife research projects as well. So it's just a lot of collaborations, and I think that makes a lot of the research stronger and more applicable, and not just kind of ivory tower stuff that isn't going to be usable on the ground.
Science for science sake doesn't get us very far. We all of us who've worked in this world for a long time recognize that science needs to inform the future decisions, and you have to understand the complexity of all of those things that are working to affect our wildlife decisions that are made for wildlife. So I'm assuming, and
let's hear a little bit about Greg. Greg, you're Wyoming born and bred, right?
Yeah, I am. I grew up in Sheridan County in the little town of Bighorn, and
Beautiful Bighorn.
it's kind of funny. I was able to get involved here with all this research work on ungulates because I'm actually a historian, not a biologist, but I bring a lot of interest and background in the kind of the history and archaeology of wildlife in Wyoming, and I'm also passionate sportsman as well. I grew up elk hunting, did a little tiny bit of mule deer guiding up in the Gros Ventre Mountains near Jackson. So anyway, it was just a way to combine my interest in history and writing and filmmaking with this wildlife research, which I think is so exciting and just setting, it's kind of the cutting edge of ungulate research on as far as migration.
Well, so taking the concept of, okay, now we have a management issue, the game and fish is identified, or not, how did you start working on migrations, ungulate migration issues through the CRU? Because this has been going on long before the Wyoming Migration Initiative itself was developed, right?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, we kind of just stumbled into it. Nowadays, when you do research on big game species, you use GPS collars. It used to be you'd use radio collars, which you have to triangulate to find. Yeah, exactly. And so with GPS collars, you get locations every couple hours for 3 to 4 years, and that has just become the industry standard for any type of study. So when I got to Wyoming, my first study was a wolf elk interaction study up near Cody.
When was that? Just me.
Yeah, that was in 2006.
Okay.
Yep. And so, wolves had been reintroduced to Yellowstone, and were starting to spill out of the park into, into the forest and the sort of working lands around Cody. And the question was, how are elk responding to the new risk of predation that wolves present? And so that was, that's what that study was about. But we used GPS collars on the elk, and when we got those collars back, we documented for the first time their migrations from winter range near Cody up into summer range in Yellowstone National Park. And then in that case, there was also this interesting question that that's a partially migratory herd, which means you have resident and migratory animals existing on the same winter range. And it was really interesting that the residents were going gangbusters, calf-cow ratios in the mid-30s, whereas the migrants were suffering really low recruitment down into the low teens. And so then there became, migration is supposed to be beneficial, and it usually is, but in that case, the sort of roles were reversed. And so trying to sort of sort out like what's going on with this migration up into Yellowstone, is that related to this low recruitment? And it turns out that the migrants were basically suffering low pregnancy rates from drought, and also Yellowstone National Park is where we keep our wolves and grizzly bears, and so they were also suffering higher rates of predation on their calves as a function of the fact that they migrate into the park, but the residents stayed in the foothills where there weren't very many predators. In fact, predators were sort of highly managed in those areas.
Probably also not losing energy because they're not moving, so they maybe.
Yeah. And so I tell that sort of example because that's really sort of, for me, that's really kind of how it happened. Then we did a study of moose in east of Jackson Lake, and then working with Hall on some of the mule deer questions in Pinedale, and all of those studies used GPS collars, and the data would come back, and we would get these maps of their migrations, and then sort of like the next step was like, okay, well, why are they doing this? What are the things that influence their migrations? And so that's just sort of led to like all of these different questions that are more directly focused on the migrations themselves.
And one thing I would add to that is that all the migration work that happens at the co-op unit is built and informed on these generations of game and fish biologists who understood the migration dynamics, but
the paper map biologists.
Yeah, exactly. But in order to understand where animals were moving, they would have to do things like go out after it had snowed, rake out an elk trail, count how many elk came through the next day, cover it back up the next day, and it would
Yeah.
it'd be a hard thing to figure out.
The
So
good
there
old days of wildlife science.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of
I love those old maps, drawn
Yeah.
in crayon and,
Right.
got the old notations, but it
Yeah.
was.
a lot of miles on foot, and then they wouldn't be able to gather a lot of information. So
Well,
this new technology makes it a lot easier.
And then the intermediate was those radio collars you were talking about, where
Right.
you'd get a ping. You'd get those locations every few days or something. So it was just A to B. You had that line.
Yep.
You had no idea what happened between those couple of points where you got them on a map. So it's just kind of the evolution of the science.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into a page pair from the book. Actually, we have this in the migration research section. We have 3 maps from 3 different time periods. The first one, this is elk migrating, the same elk that I was just talking about. Elk
Yep.
migrating up the North Fork and South Fork of the Shoshone, winter near Cody, and then migrating up those ranges into Yellowstone National Park. And that was first studied by the Craigheads, by John Craighead in the, like 60s and 70s with neck bands. And so we have a map of sort of what
Oh,
you
that's
learn
right.
from a neck
Yes.
band study. And they trapped hundreds of animals on their winter range. Then they had to go and hike around on horseback and foot in Yellowstone National Park to find the colored neck bands. Then the next phase is Bill Rudd, who's actually the co-founder of the Wyoming Migration Initiative, did his master's work on the same elk, now studying them with radio collars. So now you can triangulate and find the individuals, but you get a couple locations a week probably.
This is page 58 and 59 of
Right.
the Wild
Yeah.
Migrations Atlas. This
Yep.
is really cool because I actually am seeing exactly what I was just talking about
Yep.
a dot on a map here, a dot on a map, and all you can do is draw a straight line, and lead it to. That's really interesting to see that history.
Yeah, and then of course the final map is
Is it
one of my first co-op unit students, Arthur Middleton, who was a PhD student at the Wyoming co-op unit, and now he's net gunning elk, so you get this wide distribution across the whole winter range, and every elk has a GPS collar collecting locations every couple hours for 2 to 3 years, and you can see in the atlas just like the
big difference?
The maps are so much more detailed and so much more informative now.
So do you remember the aha moment when you said, you know what, we got to do something specifically on this issue and create the initiative?
When I don't entirely remember the aha moment, but I did take inspiration from the work of Emmeline Oslin and Joe Reese, who, as you know, Steve, sort of told the story of the Path of the
Right.
Pronghorn. And I remember watching a presentation of Emmeline after she had hiked that route, and she sort of had Joe's photos, and she was talking about what she saw on that route, and that was just kind of an aha of like, we do all this research, we do these complicated statistical analyses and bring in remote sensing and all this other stuff, but here Emmeline is just telling this simple story
Right.
of how the animals move along and what she saw and what they experience, and also I think in that moment I was like, this is so much more compelling. This is so much more interesting to the general public than, sort of like these scientific papers
Well,
that
and
we
that's,
write.
interestingly, this is kind of a segue to me
Mm-hmm.
personally. I have a background, an undergraduate degree in wildlife science, and I always knew I didn't want to be a scientist. I
Mm-hmm. Right.
mean, I got the science, I understood it, but the core part is taking that science and making it interesting, making it understandable about why we're doing this, so people can tie it into what they're doing in their daily lives, or it's just something cool and wow, this still happens
Right.
in America.
Well,
It's great.
So I was working in Pinedale when a lot of this stuff with Path of the Pronghorn was being learned. And Hall's original maps without the evolution of where they're at now, I remember the first one I saw and I was like, wow, this is awesome. We were constantly just bringing the postdoctoral approach to the energy companies, to the folks, the decision makers. And in the after hours when we would sit around and talk about it and imbibe in some adult beverages,
You don't do that.
we really just started saying, well, what's the story here? And the Path of the Pronghorn was launched informally, picked up by the folks who, WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society, Joel Berger, Emmeline, Joe was doing his photographing, National Geographic Society, and they made it a story. And that story moved individuals to do conservation, moved the Forest Service to protect that path, and really raise the awareness of these long distance migrations in that part of the world beyond the people that would normally care about it, which was your researchers, your wildlife biologists, and your managers out there, to the point that when you mention Path of the Pronghorn now, almost everyone that knows a little bit about migrations knows what you're talking about.
Right. Yeah, and that was kind of, that storytelling was on our mind, but also on my mind, and I think Hall's too. Hall's, of course, a co-author on the book.
It's talking about Hall Sawyer, who's a biologist with Western Ecosystems Technology.
Yep.
Yeah.
As you know, Steve, that Path of the Pronghorn is only traversed by, about 300 or 400 animals, right?
I don't even think it's that many
and
through the last couple winters. So.
And so we kind of had this knowledge of like, okay, well, and also that migration corridor is a little bit unique for pronghorn in terms of how
the high elevation
and the high fidelity, and they're going up and over the Gros Ventre. Most of our pronghorn are out in the big sagebrush basins, and they wander a lot more than those pronghorn do. And so there was this one migration story of a somewhat anomalous small herd of pronghorn, and that's the migration story that most people knew about. And so now with the Atlas, that is one of about 70 different stories from dozens of migrations all around the state. So that was kind of the goal of like, well, we need to tell this broader story because there's a bunch of other herds, nearly 1 million animals in Wyoming that are migrating.
Right.
And the other thing was we hadn't researched any mule deer yet, so we had to get that going.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they're the champion of all migrators as far as having spectacular distances they're covering and everything.
Yeah, I mean, when Hall was doing his work, they stopped at the anticline.
Right.
And I remember talking to him saying, well, okay, how do we know that these animals they're stopping there? Well, that's where the winter range was. And then when he put the control on the Wind River front animals and started saying, oh, wait a minute here. They're moving a lot further. And I've asked this question, Matt, you've heard me ask it in many forums. Why do animals walk through perfectly good winter range where you have animals already wintering to get to somewhere 100 miles south?
Yeah, well, I think we kind of know the answer to that now, at least in part. I think so. Yeah, you're referencing sort of like the Wind River front, and that is an area where, so this is the foothills of the Winds near Pinedale, and it's unique in that that's winter range for some mule deer, but there are other mule deer that on their fall migration out of the Hoback come down, they walk through that winter range, and then they keep going another 60 or 70 miles down to the Red Desert. And what I think the answer to that little puzzle is that those animals the animals basically, they learn their migrations, right? And so those animals learn to go all the way down the Red Desert for whatever reasons, whenever they did, and probably could have been centuries ago. But they learn that, and the way where mule deer are sort of programmed is once you learn that migration, that's what you do. And so it doesn't really matter that other animals are doing different things. You've got the strategy.
You're pre-wired in your head.
Yeah, and it's what you learned from your mom,
Yep.
right? And so even though you're moving through perfectly good winter range, and we have other animals that do it the opposite way. They move through. I mean, the Hoback, Steve. Like that's some of the best summer range for mule deer on the planet. And yet we have animals that blow through that, and go to some other place.
So we've got the Atlas now. We have been tracking animals that move from one spot to another. Tell us a little bit about this stopover phenomena that we're learning about using the Brownian Bridge technology, and how that can possibly help us understand how at least mule deer move through some of these landscapes.
Yeah, so the stopover stuff was kind of a really neat discovery. That was originally work that Hall Sawyer did in his PhD, and basically, it starts with the observation that we think of migration as animals moving along this corridor and moving pretty rapidly, but then when you start to look at the data, you see that the points pile up in these places, and even 95% of their time for mule deer, they're not moving during migration. They're stopped overfeeding. And so we developed ways to identify those stopovers with, with the Brownian Bridge analysis. And now we have come to realize that, especially in the spring migration, but also in the fall, when mule deer are migrating and they stick around those stopover areas, they're really feeding. So in the spring, that's when the best food is. They stop over and feed in those areas. In the fall, I think they're trying to get those last bits of forage before they pile in with everybody else on the winter range where there's not much food. And
well, they run the risk of getting dumped on with some of our, Wyoming snowfalls that we can get too.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, exactly. And the bottom line for that is that I think we now understand that migration, it is movement, and we used to sort of focus on that, but now I think we better recognize that it's really about feeding. And
you refer to that as surfing the green wave. I've seen that.
Yeah, Greg, did you come up with that? Is that a communication guy thing?
That was all the scientists. I didn't do that at all. But yeah, the idea is that in the springtime, the green up moves up in elevation. So when you're down in the basin, that's where you see the first green grass. And as the snow melts up higher, then it gets green, maybe in June or July up at high elevation. So the animals are following that green wave of vegetation up in elevation to get access to the forage when it's at the peak of nutritional quality. And that's really important because that's how they get enough energy to nurse their offspring, grow antlers, and pile up enough fat on their backs that they can survive through the next winter. So.
Yeah, and didn't I see something that the predators, there was a study that showed the cats following the deer on a winter range in the west, that as they were surfing the green wave, the cats were sort of surfing the crest behind it, following their food up. And so if you think about it, it makes sense. Animals go, predators go where the food's at. And to actually try to now understand the intimacy, that how they're using the protein content, the availability of fresh forage is got to open up a lot of avenues for managers, both wildlife managers and land managers, on how to better take care of the habitat and the animals out there.
Yeah. So now, the stopovers have become kind of a focal, focal habitat areas. So, for example, the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, their habitat division, and BLM as well. They now. When they look to do habitat enhancements, they look, is there a stopover in this area? And, because obviously enhancing habitat in those stopovers where the mule deer are going to come back to feed every year is, a better place to, get better food.
So we know animals are moving. We know where they're moving now. Can we now focus on what's threatening those? And have you got into work on specific corridors, on the threats to those, and then ultimately what are the solutions to maintaining viable and functional migratory corridors?
Yeah, so there's a whole chapter in the book on threats, and that was really one of the main reasons that we created the atlas, right? We recognized, like, as we were starting to discover and document in detail these migration routes, others, we know that there are migration routes that have been identified in other parts of the West as well, and we're sort of like slowly the maps are coming online, and at the same time we recognize that we are, we're putting up fences and roads and punching holes in these landscapes, and almost all of those things make these migrations more difficult. But without the maps, you can't, some of those problems have solutions, like overpasses or modifying fences to make them more wildlife friendly, or directionally drilling around migration corridors to limit surface disturbance where those animals move through and feed. Those solutions exist, but they can't be implemented unless you have the detailed map of the corridor. And so that was really kind of a primary reason for creating the atlas, was sort of like, make better maps so that we could do better planning and better conservation. And we are, and the threats, that's been kind of an active area of research. Of course, quite a few studies looking at road mortality. We know fences are kind of a pernicious barrier on the landscape that's kind of semi-permeable. They can move through, but occasionally get caught up. Also restricts their movement and their ability to sort of move freely to adapt to snow and green up and all these other things. Subdivisions are, increased disturbance. Oil and gas disrupts migrations.
Solar and wind as well.
Yeah, increasingly,
Yeah.
we've got lots of wind coming into Wyoming.
I think putting more people on this country and on the planet probably does a lot too, because that we need more energy, we need more food, we need more space, we need more recreational places and everything else. Is there a threat that hunters are going to take this map and say, okay, I'm going to go sit and, because hunters traditionally have known where some of these are. There's the famous one on the Green River for pronghorn. There's the famous ones up around Cody for the big bucks and big bulls migrating out of the Yellowstone down onto the National Forest. Are we opening up a can of worms here to consumptive users that could have an impact on some of these herds?
So, hunters have known about a lot of these corridors for a long time, and not just, for the past 100 years, but probably for the last, 5,000 years. In some
So going back
yeah.
pre-European.
Yeah, pre-settlement. And so we have these great maps now. They show things. A lot of times it's showing hunters and outfitters things that they already knew. The game and fish managers, now that they understand the timing of these things so well with the GPS data, a lot of the hunting seasons are set so that you won't be hunting the herd right during the middle of their migration when they're the most vulnerable. So that happens. Then there's the feedback loop, right? If hunters are suddenly super successful, let's just, hypothetically say they were able to kill a lot more mule deer one year, then there's a feedback into the management system of, we'll have less, less hunting licenses the next year or whatever. So, and then speaking from experience, I've been hunting in an area where there's a migratory herd near Matiti for elk. I've been hunting there for more than 20 years, and we always knew that elk were migrating through there. Now there's really good data of precisely the trails they're using and stuff. And the thing is, you still have to connect with that animal on the ground. And they're experts at avoiding us. They always have been. Even if we know where their trails are, it still could take, many, many days to find the specific animal in that specific migration spot. Game and fish managers do worry that people will just camp out right in some of these really tight bottleneck areas, and I think that's it's a mild concern. The idea is that 100 elk are coming through, and
Well, hopefully your atlas, if folks take the time to read about it and get to understand this stuff, will prevent some of that.
Yeah, it's a matter of hunting ethics, to not stop them in a spot where they have no other option,
Right.
And I don't know. There's just a lot of time. A lot of animals migrate at night. That's another thing that happens. So even if you knew exactly where it was, you're probably going to
They're going to be in a different place tomorrow morning.
You're going to have your head on the bedroll when they're
or
moving through.
next year. Sometimes there's a month differential in when they migrate one year versus the next, depending on how much snow's falling in the mountains, whatever.
Hunting's never going to be like going to the supermarket. So
Right now, I can get online and see some of these cameras on some of the underpasses, and we also. You guys, for the last few years, have been doing live updates on social media on specific deer. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, let's break it back. The communications is something. So tell us generally just how that got started and how let's just talk about the communications effort, because that has been unique with what y'all have done.
Yeah, I think we've one of the things we knew when we started, and one of the reasons to start the Migration Atlas is people are just fundamentally interested and fascinated by migrations, and it's sort of it's non-denominational, right? It's like state wildlife managers, federal wildlife managers. Western Governors Association has their corridor. program, the oil and gas, like the Jonah and the Pinedale Anticline, those mitigation funds are directed towards conserving ungulate migration, and lots of the land trusts are focused, and it's just something that these animals are they make some of the same journeys that we make, right? When we go up into the hills to hunt or camp or fish or whatever. And so I think it's just, the public is just sort of fascinated about it. And so when we started like the Wyoming Migration Initiative in 2012, and then the Atlas was sort of our signature effort out of that, one of the foci of the Wyoming Migration Initiative was to better communicate the science, the migration science, to the public primarily, but also to translate it where needed for managers and decision makers and policy makers, not relying, not forcing them to go to the original literature to sort of understand where the corridors are and what threats they face.
And so, there's a lot of different tools that you can use to do that. Matt did a lot of live tweeting of some of the mule deer captures where they're placing GPS collars. Social media has obviously been huge for the Wyoming Migration Initiative because we can directly reach out to those super broad audiences of hunting groups and just interested people.
I love it because it's not political news coming from my friends. It's more stuff that fills my news feed, the stuff I'm super interested in. So.
Yeah. So one of the innovations that Matt figured out was if you pick out a specific animal, you can tweet or post on Facebook where it is during its migration, and then for the public, that's just a great story that they can grab onto because they can think about visualizing one animal making this big long journey, and so every couple of days they're like, oh, where is that deer now? And so they get used to this idea of the animal as a character. They put themselves in the animal's shoes and really learn to empathize with these really long journeys, 150-mile journeys some of these mule deer are taking. So that's been really successful.
Which is awesome until one dies by, for whatever natural causes, predation, so you guys have dealt with that because you had Jet, right?
Right, yeah. And, we knew...
They're going to die, right? We know.
Right.
So
that's the fate of a prey animal. It's going to happen. Yeah.
Right. And we knew with Jet that she would eventually die, and, she might be killed by a hunter. She might be poached. She might die on a fence. She might get hit on a road. Or she might die from winter starvation, like many of our mule deer do in harsh winters. And it turns out that was her fate. And so, we kind of used that moment to talk about the challenges of getting through the winter for our mule deer herds. And when she died, she'd already finished her fall migration, and we don't really tell her story during winter, so she died in late December. But for the spring, we let it sit for a couple of months, and then we sort of put the story together, and it was just sort of about what animals face during winter and the costs of raising a fawn and the negative energy balance that they're in during winter when there's nothing to eat and they're pushing through snow. And it was 100% positive. Everybody was just like, there was a lot of sort of rest in peace, Jet. And then after that, there were a few voices coming back on saying, okay, we're sad that Jet's gone, but when are you doing the next one?
Who's next? And that was Mo.
Right.
So part of the idea is that, we can tell the story of this individual that dies, but the larger herd goes on, and it always has for, countless.
Need Richard Attenborough voice when you do that.
Right.
Yeah. But that's the cycle of these things, and people were ready for the next animal, and so we had Mo, and we tracked her from almost at Interstate 80 in southern Wyoming up 150 miles into the Grovant, and then there was another deer. Do we want to get right into that? So
yeah, she's the record holder now, right?
Right. So that same spring, we had the 150-mile migration record was broken by this particular deer named 255, and she had originally been collared in 2016 in the summer and migrated all the way to Idaho. And so Matt and the biologist thought, well, maybe this is just a dispersal. This is a one-time deal. So they were going to keep an eye on her, except her GPS collar malfunctioned that summer, and they completely lost track of her and thought, oh, we had this 240-mile, 250-mile migrator, and we have no idea where she is. Well, 2 years later, we were doing more captures in the Rock Springs area, and
which is the winter range
the
where we
winter
originally
range.
caught her. Yeah.
So 250 miles south of where we lost her. And there were a bunch of deer out there with collars that had malfunctioned, and the helicopter pilot had David Rivers with Native Range Capture Services. He had a direction from Matt to pick up any deer that had a collar on it where he wasn't hearing any signal. And so he picked up one of these animals and brought it back to the capture crew, and the serial number matched the same deer that we'd lost in 2016. So she had clearly migrated all the way back from Island Park, Idaho, through Yellowstone, Grand Teton National Park, the Hoback Range, the whole length of the Wind River Range, and back to the Winter Range. And so there she was, and we said, all right, we're going to get it right this time. We put on a new collar,
Right.
and she repeated that same migration.
Wow.
And so
That's
we were
amazing.
able to bring the public along and show how she migrated not only 150 miles back north to the Hoback, but then continued another 90 miles north into Idaho through these amazing areas. And she did what you were saying before, where she bypassed a lot of good summer range.
Oh
But
no,
the thing is,
that's one of my favorite places in the world, and I'll
Yeah.
tell you what, man, that's such a game-rich environment and
yeah,
great habitat. It's it's sort of like when we hunt elk. What's over the next ridge? What's over the next ridge?
Yeah.
We just
We're gonna
keep
find that
going.
one.
So
and so probably for her, she was probably born in Idaho, and her mother
Wow.
showed her the migration down to the Red Desert, and now she was pregnant this year, and we tried. Matt, you saw her.
We tried to catch up with her on some range and see if she had a fawn, but we were unsuccessful.
Oh.
Yeah.
well, so
Yeah.
this research goes beyond just telling a story. It almost becomes entertainment for folks, where they're spending time, free time, following what 255's doing. The history of Mo and Jet, picking up the Atlas, and I think that's great, because the more we get people to understand this stuff, the better chance we have a chance of making some better conservation decisions and ensuring this. And looking at all the old maps, and when colleagues of ours would come to presentations and they go, well, here's all the migrations we know we lost. And I'd be like, well, God, what do we have left? If we're really good at documenting the decline, can we document our conservation efforts to save, protect, and conserve, and maybe even restore some of the migratory pathways that are out there? And I know I just was flipping through the book, Matt, and you see I-80, which is the big ribbon of concrete that goes through the southern part of the state, how those animals stack up there. And I hear there's efforts underway to maybe try to address some of that here in the near future. And I think that's awesome. If we could get those animals back to doing what they used to do, we've got a better chance of keeping those populations in better condition and better numbers. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that the Atlas, kind of one of the messages is sort of the power of maps. And one ways in which the maps are powerful is they catalyze conservation. Mm-hmm. And so we have a whole section, the last section, the last chapter in the Atlas is about conservation. And so it looks at many of the successful efforts that have occurred in Wyoming that have made these migrations easier and made them more protected. And so they look at road crossing structures, wildlife-friendly fencing, new efforts to conserve.
The big one in Pinedale there, yeah.
Yeah, conserve
Luke
the Fremont Lake bottleneck, that big purchase to conserve and open up that bottleneck, remove the fences. There's also efforts to increasingly identify, a lot of these corridors in Wyoming rely on big private ranches, which are doing a great job of keeping this landscape open and permeable and allowing these animals to migrate on them. But of course, some of those ranches are at risk of subdivision. And so now that we have better maps, the land trusts are working to sort of identify those big ranches that some of our corridors depend on completely. And and of course you can put conservation easements on those if you got a willing rancher landowner, and that's a great solution to keep those landscapes open. So the whole that last chapter sort of walks through all the different conservation efforts, and I think it's hopeful. We can.
Well, we're seeing policy now
right.
related to this stuff.
Yep.
There's been directions from the state. Wyoming Game and Fish Commission adopted, migration corridors into their crucial habitat or critical habitat matrix that they use. And now we've actually seen some direction from the Secretary of Interior to basically tell his agencies, work with the states on this stuff and make sure that you conserve these special features in the landscape. And God, I would have loved that 15 years ago in Pinedale, Wyoming. We could have done so much more than we were able to get done there. But I think it's telling, and it shows the importance of the work you're doing, how you're influencing wildlife management, and how you're going to influence, not just Wyoming, but other states. Because I know when I go to other states, people are talking about, well, we think we got deer that go further than Matt's deer over there, so we're going to go put collars
They probably
on
do.
Prove us wrong,
and,
please.
and Matt, you and Jim Heffelfinger and some others have been taking some of this science out to other biologists in other states through a series of workshops where you're helping them understand some of the things that you've done, answering their questions so that the technology or the concepts can be applied in other places in other states, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Wyoming is kind of, for one reason or another, maybe in part because we have so much oil and gas development, which has also funded a lot of these
Absolutely.
studies. We've kind of been ground zero for migration mapping and research and management on the state side. And other Western states have a little more time to, map their migrations.
Different threats.
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
different threats, but land uses aren't changing as rapidly. And so, as the sort of migration story has growing out of Wyoming, other Western states have been sort of interested in learning from what Wyoming has been doing, and that was the genesis of the migration workshops, which the Mule Deer Foundation helped fund as well, and through Jim's leadership with WAFWA's Mule Deer Working Group, that was kind of the perfect nexus to interface with all the other mule deer managers across the state, and we kind of developed this workshop where we could sort of take the show on the road, and it was sort of half migration science and management, and then also the other half was there's some policy bits, but also training wildlife managers who have that GPS data how to analyze and come up with these.
And you've put a couple hundred folks through that, biologists and other managers through that, correct?
Yeah, we have interacted with all 11 Western states. We had trainings start. We've done 4 trainings. One last October was in Oregon, and that was Oregon, California, Washington, and then June, August, and September of this year we did Nevada, which was Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Wyoming, which was Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico. And then the last one was Bozeman with Montana and Idaho.
And that kind of work is so important because even if you've been collaring animals for a long time, if you haven't, you'll end up with millions of GPS points. And so you need to do some analysis to be able to get useful data about where's the high use corridor. Because conservation dollars are limited across the whole region. So if you're going to do a conservation easement, do one in a spot that's going to benefit a migration or habitat treatment, the same, or put in an overpass. You don't want to spend $10 million on an overpass if it's not in a spot that animals are likely to use it. So this data helps all of that.
In the conservation world, you're starting to see things become more mainstream like this. There's now an extension in ArcGIS that you can produce movement corridor maps and home ranges without the intrinsic data. Now, it's not going to be as accurate as what you guys are all doing, but that shows me that there's more of a need for it. Folks want to know what's going on. They want to be able to make better decisions. And we at the Mule Deer Foundation have been working on a migration initiative that we just received a grant for from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And so we're going to be stepping up from more of how can we get more money to the ground? How can we get what you all do and what you've been doing to more people when they need it? And, being a nonprofit, we can venture into that policy world and we can get more in depth in some of the policy discussions and political discussions, to be honest with you, that, may not be suited for a state or a university or a researcher to get into, but we're going to be getting into that realm, and we'll be talking more about that over the next few months and be launching that in early 2019. But we want to say is we're trying to support what y'all are doing. We're trying to get more information to the people on the ground, whether it be a private landowner, a biologist, a researcher, so that they can make a better decision to maintain these corridors and be a better steward of the land. So,
well, and I think that was one of the aspects of the migration workshops, which was really rewarding. I think as we went around the West, almost all of the Western states they all have, these big game herds are important to every Western state, right? The tags from these herds basically, in addition to the fishing tags, fund those state agencies. Most of these big game herds migrate or need to, one way or another, freely use these Western landscapes. The science shows that migration is really important. That's sort of the key to abundance and productivity of our big game herds. And we now have the ability to map those migration corridors, and we also have the ability to make those journeys easier and protect those corridors, modify fences, work with the road crossings. And so that was really kind of rewarding for I think everybody from our team to just see how much consensus there is in the importance of these big game herds, the importance of migration, and the importance of conservation. And I think kind of the West is sort of on board with that idea.
That's really exciting. It's almost like 100 years ago when lots of national forests and national parks were made that really helped all this conservation of these herds happen. And we're seeing another consensus like that happening now around migration. So that's really
telling the
cool.
story is really important. And I don't know if it's still up in Cody at the museum, but Arthur Middleton's display on all of this stuff, reaching all those people that are going into the Native American and the firearms museum, seeing all that, the social media, the atlas. So what's next for you guys, Matt? Is it just now going out and getting more people aware? Is there still more work to be done on the research side? Are you looking at, pushing the atlas out to all your major retailers? I know you've been on the road and you're going back on the road very soon. So what's next for you guys?
Well, as far as the Atlas, we have an event in Cody, Wyoming coming up on the 15th and one in Sheridan on the 16th of November. Our tour has been sort of focused in Wyoming because that's the key audience that we try and reach with this information. But we think the Atlas has it's kind of gives the recipe for migration science. And so we definitely want to pursue as big of an audience for it as we can. It's available for sale right now. It's easy to get through the Oregon State University Press website. That's our publisher that we worked with.
What's the price on it, Greg?
It's $50. So Oregon State University Press, Wild Migrations. If you just put that into your search engine, you'll be able to find it. Or of course, you can always come to www.migrationinitiative.org, and we can get you hooked up with a copy.
And I want to emphasize that this is a stunning book. I mean, it is
Yeah.
a coffee table book with beautiful photography and artwork in there, wonderful storytelling, as well as these incredible maps and this very interesting science-based, history-based, and conservation-focused messaging. So it's a stunning piece of work, and it is well worth. You might go $50, but this book is it is a lifetime.
Worth so much more.
It is worth a ton more. Just the information that's in it, and it is beautiful. It is a great piece of work that you guys have done.
So I love the dedication. Can I read it, Matt?
Absolutely.
To all the people, past and present, who care about the wildlife and wild places of Wyoming. And I think, that sums it up well. I mean, the fact that you got Annie Proulx, the writer, Ghost Stories of Wyoming, to get involved in this, the fact that you're out there got something that I think is going to be on, it's not going to go to the bookshelf. It's going to stay on the desk for a while in my household, and probably end up on my wife's environmental science classes. So,
yeah, if you're a person who loves maps or wildlife, the maps in here are just beautiful. They are all produced by our partners at University of Oregon Infographics Lab, and they produce just gorgeous maps, and they're going to really enable people to see the landscape and see these animals' stories in ways that they hadn't before.
And it's accessible, and that was our goal, was to bring migration science to the public.
Oh yeah, this is not
Yeah.
wonk, science wonk, policy wonk,
No.
anything. This is very understandable, logical. I mean, it is, there's a lot of information, but it is a lot of good, easy to understand. It just all comes together
Yeah.
in this book.
If you can get through the hunting regulations of most of our western states,
Almost about the same amount of pages.
yeah, you can breeze through the
Yeah.
Wild Migrations Atlas.
So research is going to continue.
Yeah. So what we we're continuing to do migration research on that front. The next big push, or really a continuation of work we've been doing, is we really need to get a more fine-honed sense of this influence of development. The smoking gun is we don't know where the tipping point is, and because we don't know where that tipping point is, that makes it really hard for us to advise.
Meaning, when it gets too dense, that they're not going to move through there
Right.
anymore. That's what you mean by the
Yeah,
tipping point.
especially with oil and gas development. Wyoming is helping the U.S. become energy independent, and a lot of that is coming on the backs of our mule deer, and so we know that those animals can tolerate some development, but we need to sort of understand where that tipping point is so that we don't go past it. And that is a hard question from a research perspective, but that's one that we're really focused on in the coming years. The next focus is just to continue the mapping. There's still lots of herds in Wyoming, and in some cases where we have the data, but we haven't done the analyses to produce the maps. And then, of course, we're also increasingly helping other western states develop mapping programs for big game herds in their own state, and so that's an additional focus as well. And then the migration initiative, we will continue to tell these stories.
Okay, so again, if you're interested in getting the book, the Atlas, or learning more about the Wyoming Migration Initiative, or getting on to their social media and trying
Or donating to them.
donating,
Yeah.
yep, absolutely. Migrationinitiative.org, correct? The other thing is, for anybody who's interested, is if you are a young person interested in wildlife science, coopunits.org, is that correct? Co-op units?
It's USGS.
.org. Nope,
Oh,
coopunits.org has information about the cooperative research units as well, and they'll have a link as well to Matt's page, so that because if you're interested in this, if this stuff makes you excited, co-op units might be the way for you to do your science, get your degree, and help wildlife conservation moving forward.
Great.
Absolutely.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you both.
We really appreciate what you do, and we look forward to working with y'all, and hopefully we'll be back, do another episode in a year or two and get us updated.
Absolutely.
Sounds great.
Until that time, thank you guys. This is Jody Stemler.
And I'm Steve Belinda from the University of Wyoming in the greatest square in the Union, Powder River. Let her buck.
Thanks for talking mule deer with Steve Belinda and Jody Stemler. The Mule Deer Foundation is the only conservation group in North America dedicated to restoring, improving, and protecting mule deer and black-tailed deer and their habitat. MDF is a strong voice for hunters in access, wildlife management, and conservation policy issues. To find out more, visit www.muledeer.org and stay tuned for the next episode of Talkin' Mule Deer.